The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile corridors of Seattle Memorial Hospital, casting harsh shadows across white walls that had witnessed 1,000 emergencies. In the trauma bay, a quiet nurse named Caleb Stone stood in the corner, his hands steady as he organized medical supplies with the precision of a man who had done far more dangerous work in far darker places. The surgeons around him laughed, their voices sharp with arrogance, mocking the quiet nurse who never spoke unless spoken to. They didn't know that Caleb had spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL medic, pulling wounded brothers from firefights in places the world would never hear about. They didn't know that his hands had stopped bleeding in mud-soaked trenches while bullets screamed overhead. They saw only a nurse. But when Commander Wyatt Thorne was rushed through those doors with catastrophic injuries and the lead surgeon's hands began to shake, Caleb would step forward and do what he had always done, save lives, no matter the cost. And when the ruthless mercenaries of the Vanguard breached the hospital to finish their mission, Caleb and his loyal German shepherd, Ace, would transform those sterile hallways into a battlefield where only one side would walk out alive. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Seattle Memorial Hospital stood like a fortress of glass and steel against the gray Pacific Northwest sky, its 23 floors towering over the city with the quiet authority of an institution that had saved tens of thousands of lives. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and floor polish, the kind of sterile cleanliness that promised safety but never quite erased the underlying tension of a place where life and death negotiated every single day. The trauma department occupied the third floor, a maze of corridors lined with examination rooms, supply closets, and the massive double doors that led to the trauma bay, the arena where the hospital's best surgeons proved their worth. Caleb Stone had been working in that department for 8 months. He was 34 years old, lean and compact, with close-cropped dark hair threaded with premature gray and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was weathered in a way that didn't match his age, marked by thin scars that most people never noticed, one along his jawline, another just above his left eyebrow. He moved through the hospital with an economy of motion that suggested military training, though he never spoke about his past. His voice was quiet, his demeanor calm, and his presence so unassuming that most of the hospital staff forgot he was in the room. The surgeons, however, never let him forget his place. Dr. Marcus Bellamy was the chief trauma surgeon, a man in his early 50s with silver hair, designer glasses, and an ego that filled every room he entered. He had graduated top of his class from Johns Hopkins, completed his residency at Mass General, and spent the last 2 decades building a reputation as one of the finest trauma surgeons on the West Coast. He was brilliant. He was also cruel. "Stone," Bellamy called out from across the trauma bay, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you planning to stand there all day, or are you going to prep the crash cart?" Caleb didn't flinch. He simply nodded and moved toward the equipment, his hands already reaching for the defibrillator paddles. Behind Bellamy, 2 other surgeons snickered. Dr. Trevor Knox, a younger surgeon with slicked-back blonde hair and a habit of checking his reflection in every polished surface, leaned toward his colleague and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't know why they even let him in here," Knox said. "He's barely qualified to empty bedpans." The other surgeon, Dr. Simone Cross, a sharp-featured woman with a perpetual scowl, nodded in agreement. "Quiet as a church mouse," she muttered, probably too scared to speak up. Caleb heard every word. He always did, but he said nothing. Because speaking wasn't what saved lives. Action was. And Caleb Stone had learned a long time ago that the loudest voices in the room were rarely the most capable. He finished prepping the crash cart and stepped back, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture parade ground perfect, a habit he couldn't shake even after 3 years of civilian life. The trauma bay was quiet for the moment. The morning shift had been slow, a few minor injuries. a car accident victim who had been stabilized and moved to surgery, a child with a broken arm who had cried until Caleb knelt beside him and spoke in a voice so calm and steady that the boy had stopped mid-sob and simply stared. Caleb had that effect on people, especially the ones who were scared. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 10:47 a.m. In 13 minutes, everything would change. If you believe that true strength is found in silence and action, give this story a like and let it remind you that heroes don't always announce themselves. Caleb stepped out of the trauma bay and walked down the corridor toward the staff lounge. His shift didn't end for another 6 hours, but he had learned to take breaks when he could. The hospital was unpredictable. Calm one moment, chaos the next. He pushed open the door to the lounge and was greeted by the familiar sight of vending machines, mismatched chairs, and a coffee pot that had been brewing the same stale pot since 6 that morning. Sitting in the corner, his tail thumping softly against the linoleum floor, was Ace. Ace was a 4-year-old German shepherd with a sleek black and tan coat, intelligent amber eyes, and a presence that commanded respect. He wore a service dog vest with a small patch that read PTSD Service Animal, though that barely scratched the surface of what Ace truly was. Ace had been Caleb's partner during his final 3 years as a SEAL. Together, they had cleared buildings in Ramadi, tracked insurgents through the mountains of Afghanistan, and pulled wounded operators out of kill zones under withering fire. Ace had saved Caleb's life more than once, and when Caleb left the Navy, there had never been a question of whether Ace would come with him. They were a team, always. Caleb knelt down and ran his hand along Ace's head, scratching behind his ears. The dog leaned into the touch, his eyes half closing in contentment. "Good boy," Caleb murmured. "Quiet day so far." Ace's ears twitched, as if he didn't quite believe it. "Smart dog." Caleb poured himself a cup of the stale coffee, took a sip, and grimaced. It tasted like burnt rubber, but it was caffeinated, and that was all that mattered. He sat down in one of the chairs and pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages. Most were from his sister, checking in to see how he was doing. A few were from old teammates, asking if he wanted to meet up for a beer or catch a Seahawks game. He responded to a couple, kept the answers short, and pocketed the phone. He didn't talk much about the past, not because it was classified, though some of it was, but because the past was heavy, and carrying it into every conversation didn't make it any lighter. The door to the lounge swung open, and Dr. Knox walked in, his expensive watch glinting under the fluorescent lights. He saw Caleb and smirked. "Taking another break, Stone?" Knox asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Must be nice not having any real responsibilities." Caleb looked at him for a moment, then took another sip of his coffee. "Just staying ready," he said quietly. Knox laughed. "Ready for what? Someone to need their pillow fluffed?" Caleb didn't respond. Knox shook his head and walked out, muttering something under his breath. Ace growled softly. Caleb reached down and rested a hand on the dog's head. "Easy," he said. "Not worth it." Ace huffed, as if to say he disagreed. Caleb finished his coffee, stood, and clipped Ace's leash to his vest. Together, they walked back toward the trauma bay. As they rounded the corner, the hospital's emergency alert system crackled to life. "All available trauma staff to the bay. Incoming critical patient. ETA 2 minutes. Repeat, all available trauma staff to the bay." Caleb's posture shifted. His shoulders squared, his eyes sharpened. Ace's ears went up, his body tense and ready. They moved quickly toward the trauma bay, Caleb's hand resting on Ace's back as they walked. He didn't know it yet, but the man about to come through those doors would change everything. If you stand with those who are underestimated and overlooked, drop a comment below with one word: ready. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses rushed to their stations. Dr. Bellamy barked orders, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Dr. Knox and Dr. Cross flanked him, their expressions tense but eager. This was what they lived for, the high-stakes drama, the adrenaline, the chance to prove their brilliance. Caleb stood near the corner, Ace sitting obediently at his side. His hands were already gloved, his mind running through protocols he had executed 100 times before, though never in a hospital this clean, and never without the sound of gunfire in the background. The double doors burst open. Paramedics rushed in, pushing a gurney at full speed. On it was a man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered and powerful, even in his current state. His tactical pants were soaked with blood, his shirt cut away to reveal a chest covered in scars and a massive wound just below his ribcage. His face was pale, his breathing shallow and ragged. But his eyes were still sharp. "GSW to the lower abdomen," one of the paramedics shouted. "Severe internal bleeding, BP dropping fast. He's been in and out of consciousness." Dr. Bellamy moved to the head of the gurney, his hands already reaching for the patient. "Get him on the table, now." They transferred the man onto the surgical table with practiced efficiency. Bellamy leaned over him, his fingers probing the wound. "This is bad," he muttered. "Looks like the bullet nicked the hepatic artery. We need to get him into surgery immediately." The wounded man's eyes fluttered open. His gaze swept the room, assessing, calculating. Then his eyes landed on Caleb. For a moment, something passed between them. Recognition, not of faces, but of brotherhood. The man's lips moved, his voice barely a whisper. "Seal?" Caleb didn't answer. But his eyes said enough. The man nodded slightly, then his eyes closed again. Dr. Bellamy didn't notice. He was too focused on the wound, his hands moving quickly but without the confidence Caleb had seen in true battlefield medics. "We need to clamp the artery," Bellamy said. "Cross, get me." His hand slipped. Blood sprayed across his surgical gown. "Damn it," Bellamy hissed. "I can't get a clear view. There's too much blood." Caleb stepped forward. "Doctor," he said quietly, "let me assist." Bellamy shot him a glare. "I don't need a nurse's help, Stone. Get back." "With respect, sir, I've done this before." Knox laughed. "In nursing school?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "In Fallujah." The room went silent. Bellamy stared at him. "What did you say?" "I was a Navy SEAL medic for 12 years, Caleb said, his voice steady. "I've performed this exact procedure in the field under fire. Let me help." Dr. Cross scoffed. "You expect us to believe that?" "I don't care what you believe," Caleb said. "But if you don't clamp that artery in the next 60 seconds, he's going to bleed out on your table." Bellamy's face flushed with anger. But he looked down at the patient, at the blood pooling faster than he could control, and he hesitated. "Fine," he snapped, "but if you screw this up, I won't." Caleb moved to the table. His hands were steady, his mind clear. He didn't think, he acted. He reached into the wound with surgical precision, his fingers finding the torn artery by feel alone. He could see it in his mind, the anatomy, the angles, the pressure points. He had done this in the back of helicopters, in bombed-out buildings, in the dirt with nothing but a flashlight and sheer will. "Clamp?" he said. A nurse handed it to him. Caleb placed the clamp with perfect precision, and the bleeding stopped. The monitors stabilized. The room exhaled. Dr. Bellamy stared at him, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. "Get him into surgery," Caleb said quietly. "He's stable now, but he needs a full repair." Bellamy said nothing. He simply turned and walked toward the surgical wing, his team following. But before he left, he glanced back at Caleb with a look that promised consequences. Caleb didn't care. He had saved a life. That was all that mattered. Stay with us. What happens next will reveal just how far jealousy and pride can drive desperate men. 3 hours later, Caleb was called into the office of Dr. Raymond Fletcher, the hospital administrator. Fletcher was a thin man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually tired expression. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded, his face unreadable. "Sit down, Mr. Stone," he said. Caleb sat. Ace lay down beside him, his eyes watchful. Fletcher sighed. "I've received a formal complaint from Dr. Bellamy. He claims you overstepped your authority in the trauma bay, performed a medical procedure without proper clearance, and endangered a patient's life." Caleb's expression didn't change. "I saved his life." "That's not the point." "That's exactly the point." Fletcher removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Look, I don't doubt your skills, but this hospital has protocols, chains of command, and when you bypass those, the patient was dying. Dr. Bellamy is one of the finest surgeons in this city." Dr. Bellamy's hand slipped. Fletcher's jaw tightened. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth." There was a long silence. Finally, Fletcher put his glasses back on and looked at Caleb with something like regret. "I'm sorry, Mr. Stone, but I have no choice. You're being terminated, effective immediately." Caleb stared at him. "You're firing me for saving a man's life." "I'm firing you for insubordination and violating hospital policy." Caleb stood slowly. His hands were steady, but his eyes were cold. "Understood," he said quietly. He turned and walked toward the door, Ace at his side. "For what it's worth," Fletcher said, "I believe you did the right thing." Caleb paused. "Then you should have stood by it." He walked out. 20 minutes later, Caleb walked through the hospital lobby, a security guard escorting him toward the exit. His belongings were in a small box under his arm. Ace walked beside him, his ears back, sensing his partner's tension. People stared. Some whispered. Caleb kept his eyes forward. He had been dishonorably discharged from places before. This was just another day. But then, from somewhere behind him, a voice called out, "Nurse Stone." Caleb stopped. He turned. Commander Wyatt Thorne, the man whose life he had saved, stood in the hallway, leaning heavily on a crutch. His face was pale, his torso wrapped in bandages, but his eyes were clear and sharp. The entire lobby fell silent. Thorne straightened as much as his injuries would allow. And then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand in a crisp, formal salute. Caleb's breath caught. He stood frozen for a moment. Then, instinctively, he returned the salute. The two men held the gesture, a silent acknowledgement of brotherhood, sacrifice, and respect. The security guard looked uncomfortable. The civilians in the lobby didn't understand what they were witnessing. But Caleb did. And so did Thorne. "Thank you, brother," Thorne said, his voice rough but steady. Caleb nodded. "Any time, sir." Thorne lowered his hand, his expression filled with gratitude. And then, the front doors of the hospital exploded inward. If the strength of this moment moved you, type "Honor" in the comments and let us know what loyalty means to you. The explosion was deafening. Glass shattered in every direction, shards slicing through the air like shrapnel. The lobby filled with smoke and screams. People dove to the ground, covering their heads, their voices lost in the chaos. Caleb reacted instantly. He dropped the box, his body shifting into combat mode. His hand reached for Ace, giving a silent command. The dog's ears went flat, his body low and ready. Through the smoke, figures emerged. 6 men dressed in black tactical gear, their faces covered by balaclavas, their hands gripping automatic rifles. They moved with military precision, sweeping the room with their weapons. One of them shouted in a deep, accented voice, "Everyone on the ground, now!" People screamed and obeyed, dropping to the floor. But Caleb didn't move. Neither did Commander Thorne. The lead mercenary, a massive man with cold blue eyes visible through his mask, stepped forward. He pointed his rifle directly at Thorne. "Commander Wyatt Thorne," the man said, his voice flat. "The Vanguard sends its regards." Thorne's jaw tightened. "You're too late. I already sent the intel." The mercenary smiled beneath his mask. "Then we'll just have to make an example of you." He raised his rifle. And Caleb moved. In one fluid motion, he grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and hurled it at the mercenary's head. The canister struck with brutal force, and the man staggered backward, his rifle firing wildly into the ceiling. Caleb was already moving. He tackled the second mercenary, driving his elbow into the man's throat and ripping the rifle from his hands. He rolled, came up in a crouch, and fired 3 controlled bursts. 2 mercenaries went down. The others scattered, taking cover behind pillars and overturned furniture. Caleb grabbed Thorne and pulled him behind the reception desk. "Stay down," Caleb ordered. Thorne, despite his injuries, grinned. "Hell of a nurse." "Former SEAL," Caleb corrected. "I know," Thorne said. "I read your file once. Caleb Stone. Silver Star. Purple Heart. 23 confirmed saves under fire." Caleb didn't respond. He was already scanning the room, calculating angles, distances, threats. Ace was at his side, teeth bared, ready. "Good boy," Caleb whispered. "Hunt?" Ace took off like a shadow, moving low and fast through the smoke. A mercenary stepped out from behind a pillar, his rifle raised. Ace hit him like a missile, jaws clamping down on the man's forearm. The rifle clattered to the ground. The man screamed. Caleb was already there. He delivered a brutal strike to the man's temple, and the mercenary dropped. 3 down, 3 to go. The lead mercenary's voice crackled over a radio. "All units, converge on the lobby. Target is protected. Engage with lethal force." Caleb's jaw tightened. More were coming. He looked at Thorne. "Can you move?" "Not fast." "Then we hold here." Thorne nodded. "What do you need?" Caleb glanced around the lobby. His mind worked like a tactical computer, cataloging resources, angles, improvised weapons. "Give me 2 minutes," he said. And then he went to work. If you believe this kind of corruption and violence must be stopped, share this story and let others see what happens when heroes rise. Caleb moved through the lobby like a ghost. He grabbed IV stands and used them to wedge doors shut. He shattered overhead lights to create pockets of darkness. He pulled medical oxygen tanks from a supply closet and positioned them near choke points. Ace stayed close, his ears rotating, listening for movement. The remaining 3 mercenaries in the lobby had regrouped near the entrance, using overturned tables as cover. They were calling for backup, their voices tense. Caleb crouched behind the reception desk, his stolen rifle resting against his shoulder. Beside him, Commander Thorne had pulled a sidearm from one of the downed mercenaries. "You always this calm under fire?" Thorne asked. "Keeps me alive," Caleb replied. The sound of boots echoed from the stairwell. "Reinforcements." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "How many men does the Vanguard usually deploy?" "For a high-value target?" Thorne said grimly. "At least a dozen." Caleb did the math. 3 down, 3 in the lobby. That left at least 6 more. Not great odds, but he had faced worse. The stairwell door burst open, and 4 more mercenaries poured into the lobby, their weapons sweeping the room. Caleb waited. Patience was a weapon. One of the mercenaries stepped past a medical oxygen tank. Caleb fired. The bullet struck the tank's valve, and it exploded in a roaring blast of pressure and flame. The mercenary was thrown backward, his body slamming into the wall. The others dove for cover, shouting into their radios. Caleb moved. He vaulted over the desk, Ace at his heels, and sprinted toward the stairwell. He knew the hospital layout by heart, every floor, every corridor, every exit, and he knew exactly where to lead them. He fired 2 more bursts, forcing the mercenaries to keep their heads down, then disappeared into the stairwell with Ace. Behind him, the lead mercenary shouted orders. "Split up. 2 units secure the commander. The rest, hunt down the SEAL." Caleb heard it all, and he smiled, because now they were playing his game. The hospital's 3rd-floor corridor was dark. Caleb had cut the power to this section using an emergency breaker he had found during his first week on the job. The fluorescent lights were dead, leaving only the faint glow of exit signs to pierce the blackness. He moved silently, his boots making no sound on the polished floor. Ace was a shadow beside him, his breathing steady and controlled. Caleb had ditched the rifle, too loud, too visible. Now he carried a scalpel in one hand and a length of rubber tubing in the other. Improvised weapons. The best kind. He heard footsteps approaching from the far end of the corridor. 2 mercenaries, moving cautiously, their rifle-mounted flashlights cutting through the darkness. Caleb pressed himself against the wall, invisible in the shadows. Ace crouched low, waiting. The first mercenary passed within 3 feet of Caleb. Caleb struck. He looped the rubber tubing around the man's neck and pulled hard, cutting off his air. The mercenary struggled, his hands clawing at the tubing, but Caleb held firm. 10 seconds. The man went limp. Caleb lowered him to the ground silently. The second mercenary turned, his flashlight sweeping toward the sound. "Marcus, you there?" Ace lunged. The dog hit the mercenary square in the chest, driving him to the ground. His rifle clattered away. Ace's jaws clamped down on the man's shoulder, and he screamed. Caleb was on him in an instant, delivering a precise strike to the temple. Silence. Caleb checked the mercenary's radio. It crackled with voices. "Unit 3, report." "Unit 3, do you copy?" Caleb smiled coldly. He pressed the transmit button. "Unit 3 is down," he said quietly. "And you're next." He dropped the radio and crushed it under his boot. Then he moved deeper into the darkness. The Vanguard's commander, the massive man with cold blue eyes, stood in the hospital lobby, his patience wearing thin. "How many men have we lost?" he demanded. "5, sir." One of his subordinates replied nervously. "5?" The commander's voice was deadly quiet. "1 man and a dog have taken down 5 of my operators?" "He's not just any man, sir. Intel confirms he's Caleb Stone, former SEAL, 12 years in Special Operations, Silver Star recipient." The commander's jaw tightened. "I don't care if he's Captain America. Find him, kill him, and bring me the commander's body." "Yes, sir." The remaining mercenaries fanned out, searching the hospital floor by floor. But they were hunting a predator who knew every corner, every shadow, every trap. And Caleb Stone was just getting started. If this truth shakes you, share this story so others can witness what happens when evil underestimates a hero. The hospital's rooftop helipad was cold and windswept. Caleb had led the final 3 mercenaries here deliberately. It was isolated, exposed, and it had one significant advantage. A damaged medical helicopter sat near the edge of the pad, its rotors still and silent. It had been grounded for maintenance 2 days ago, waiting for a part that hadn't arrived yet. But Caleb didn't need it to fly perfectly. He just needed it to fly. He crouched behind the helicopter's landing gear, Ace pressed against his side. The dog's ears were flat, his eyes locked on the rooftop access door. It burst open. The 3 remaining mercenaries stepped out, their weapons raised, their movements cautious. The commander was with them. "Stone!" the commander shouted, his voice cutting through the wind. "There's nowhere left to run. Come out, and I'll make it quick." Caleb said nothing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small remote detonator, something he had jury-rigged from the hospital's emergency generator system. He had been busy. "Last chance, Stone." Caleb pressed the button. The rooftop access door exploded inward, the blast throwing 2 of the mercenaries to the ground. The commander and the last mercenary staggered, but stayed on their feet. Caleb emerged from cover, moving fast. He tackled the remaining mercenary, driving him to the ground. They grappled, fists and elbows flying. Caleb took a hard hit to the ribs but responded with a brutal elbow strike that shattered the man's nose. The mercenary went limp. Caleb stood, breathing hard. The commander raised his rifle. "Impressive," he said coldly, "but it ends here." He fired. Caleb dove behind the helicopter, bullets sparking off the metal fuselage. Ace snarled and charged. The commander turned, but Ace was faster. The dog hit him low, jaws clamping down on his leg. The commander screamed and swung his rifle like a club, striking Ace across the head. The dog yelped and fell. Caleb's vision went red. He launched himself at the commander, his fists a blur of controlled violence. He struck the man's throat, his ribs, his knee. The commander staggered, dropping his rifle. Caleb didn't stop. He drove the man to the edge of the helipad, his hands around the commander's throat. "You hurt my dog," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm. The commander's eyes widened. Caleb threw him over the edge. The man's scream faded into the night. Caleb turned and ran to Ace. The dog was conscious, dazed but alive. Caleb ran his hands over Ace's body, checking for injuries. "You're okay," Caleb whispered. "You're okay, buddy." Ace licked his hand weakly. Caleb lifted the dog carefully and carried him to the helicopter. He climbed into the pilot's seat, Ace cradled in his lap. He had flown helicopters before, not often, but enough. He flipped switches, checking systems. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. The rotors began to turn. Caleb pulled back on the stick, and the helicopter lifted into the night sky. Below, the hospital lights glowed like a beacon. Inside, Commander Thorne and the civilians were safe. The vanguard was finished. And Caleb Stone had done what he always did. He had protected those who couldn't protect themselves. 2 weeks later, Caleb stood in a nondescript office building in downtown Seattle. Across from him sat Commander Wyatt Thorne, fully recovered, and a woman in a dark suit with the kind of eyes that saw everything. "Mr. Stone," the woman said, "my name is Director Sarah Kincaid. I run a specialized unit within Naval Special Warfare. We handle threats that fall outside conventional channels." Caleb said nothing. Ace sat beside him, fully healed, his tail thumping softly. "Commander Thorne has told me everything you did at Seattle Memorial," Kincaid continued. "You saved lives, you neutralized a terrorist cell, and you did it with nothing but improvised weapons and a very good dog." She leaned forward. "We want you, Mr. Stone, both of you. A place where your skills won't be wasted, where you can continue to serve." Caleb looked at Thorne. The commander nodded. "It's a good team, Caleb. The best." Caleb looked down at Ace. The dog looked back at him, and Caleb could swear the dog was smiling. He looked back at Kincaid. "What's the mission?" Kincaid smiled. "Protecting the ones who can't protect themselves, just like you always have." Caleb thought about the hospital, about the civilians he had saved, about the arrogant surgeons who had mocked him. He thought about the salute, and he knew his answer. "We're in," he said. Ace barked once, as if in agreement. Kincaid extended her hand. Caleb shook it. And just like that, Caleb Stone and Ace found their way home. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes that faith still lives in ordinary days. Leave a comment about the blessings you've witnessed in your own life. And subscribe for more stories that remind us we are never too lost to be found again. May God bless you, keep you warm in your winters, and fill your home with the quiet, steady light of hope. What moment in your life reminded you that courage doesn't need applause, it just needs action? Share your story below.